I found him at 7,200 feet in a complete whiteout, kneeling in the snow beside a man who couldn't feel his legs. And my first thought, God help me, with a patient 15 feet away and a storm closing fast from the northwest, was that Dex Amara's hands were the steadiest thing in the entire mountain. I know how that sounds. I've been running search and rescue in Glacier National Park for 9 years, and I am not someone who loses the thread during an operation. But there is a specific quality to someone who can be fully calm when everything around them is not. And when you've spent enough of your life in emergencies, you recognize it instantly. The way you recognize a true horizon through cloud cover. Not by seeing it directly, but by knowing where everything else is orienting around it. The call had come in 3 hours earlier. 5 hikers overdue on the Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail, last jeep's ping at the upper basin, then nothing. September 28th, which sounds like fall and is actually the beginning of winter in Glacier, the kind of date that catches people who drove up from Missoula in a Subaru and thought the weather app was reliable. My crew and I had staged at the Swift Current trailhead at 1400 and pushed straight up the Ptarmigan Wall in deteriorating visibility because that is what you do. The storm had been forecast as a minor advisory. It was not a minor advisory, but here is what you need to understand before any of the rest of this makes sense. Dex Amara had come to Glacier 2 seasons ago from a trauma fellowship in Baltimore. He was Ethiopian-American, grew up in Addis Ababa until he was 12, and had the kind of quiet that isn't shyness, it's precision. He said things once and meant them completely. He moved through a scene assessment the way a good ranger moves through difficult terrain, reading multiple systems simultaneously, leaving nothing disturbed that didn't need to be. And I had spent 2 full seasons maintaining what I told myself was appropriate professional distance. We worked well together. We did not have coffee. We did not talk about anything that wasn't the mission. I am 35 years old, and this is, in retrospect, not my finest behavior. But you should know it was deliberate. That is the important part. I had made a considered decision, and I had been keeping it with considerable effort. And then September 28th happened. I reached the patient at 1547. The party was 5 hikers from Denver, 2 couples, 1 solo hiker, all competent enough to be here, and not quite competent enough for a September whiteout at this elevation. The patient was a 44-year-old named Marcus, and he had taken a fall on the slick rock approach to the tunnel, a 6-foot drop onto his back. The fact that he was conscious and articulate was good. The fact that he could not feel his feet was very much not. Dex had already immobilized him. Makeshift cervical collar from a rolled sleeping pad. Spine precautions maintained from point of contact. He'd gotten an IV line in these conditions, in these gloves, and was running a warm saline drip from a chemical heat pack wedged against the bag. The other 4 hikers were in thermal bivouac off to the side, grouped correctly, staying warm. I did my scene assessment in 4 seconds. Dex looked up at me. C-spine is unclear, he said. He felt the impact at T6. Sensation to the knees, nothing distal. Could be cord concussion, could be worse. I can't clear it in the field. Understood. I crouched across from him. Helo, that's the problem. And this is where it gets complicated. So stay with me. The extraction window had just closed. The storm had accelerated, a sentence that describes a significant percentage of my 9 years in this park, and command had radioed that helicopter ops were grounded until morning at the earliest. We had a potentially spinal injured patient, 4 shaken but stable hikers, dropping temps, and somewhere between 12 and 16 hours until first light. Cabin 6 is 2 kilometers northwest, I said. Ptarmigan Lake Patrol Cabin. Stocked, weatherproof, emergency HF radio. We moved to shelter. Dex looked at me across the patient, not without a proper litter, moving a possible C-spine on improvised carry in these conditions. I know what I'm doing. It came out flatter than I intended, and something in his expression, not anger, not offense, just a very precise noticing, made me hear it the way he heard it. I know you do, he said without hesitation. I'm saying we build the litter here first. That adds 40 minutes. Then we move, not improvise carry. I looked at him. He was right. He had been saying exactly what I was about to say, and I had cut him off like he was arguing. Then let's build it, I said. That was it. No further friction. He'd already been thinking the same thing. He just needed to know I wasn't going to rush the patient into further injury, and I had needed, apparently, to be reminded that he was not my opposition. We built the litter from 2 trekking poles and the equipment frame from my pack and one of the hikers' camping mats, and it took 37 minutes, and it was good work. The other hikers helped where they could and stayed out of the way where they couldn't, and Dex managed the patient's spine and airway and kept up a quiet, steady conversation with Marcus the entire time, not to distract him, but because a conscious-oriented patient who feels connected to his provider has measurably better outcomes, and Dex knew this the way he knew everything, completely and without announcing it. We moved out at 16:31, 2 kilometers in a whiteout, 4 hikers carrying the litter in rotation. Dex walking alongside maintaining manual C-spine stabilization. Me on jeeps and terrain memory. Here's what I remember from those 2 hours. Dex's voice in the wind, even and specific, talking Marcus through every movement. We're going to tilt slightly left now. Just a few degrees. Good, you'll feel it. That's good, you're doing well. The Denver hikers on the front poles, exhausted and frightened and not quitting. The particular sound of litter carriers' boots in wind-packed snow. And at one point, when I stopped to recheck the GPS in a gust that wanted to knock me sideways, Dex's shoulder briefly against mine, steadying without comment. Neither of us mentioned it. We reached cabin 6 at 18:22, 12 by 14 feet. 2 bunks, a propane stove, an emergency HF radio, supplies for 72 hours. We got Marcus inside and onto the lower bunk. Dex did his full secondary assessment, while I got the stove going and accounted for the other 4 hikers. Marcus had sensation in his right foot by now. A good sign. Dex gave me the look I had learned over 2 seasons to interpret, better than I expected. Not out of the woods. By 19:00, the cabin was at 62 degrees. The 4 Denver hikers were asleep on the floor in sleeping bags. The HF radio confirmed extraction at first light, 0630, weather permitting. That left 11 hours. I made coffee on the propane stove. I handed Dex a mug. We sat across from each other at the small table, and we looked at each other in the way that 2 people look at each other when they've just carried a patient 2 kilometers through a whiteout and nobody is dead. Good litter build, he said. Good IV in those conditions. He wrapped both hands around the mug. Outside, the storm. Inside, the stove and 4 people breathing in sleep and the radio on standby. Here is what I have to tell you about that table. There was 18 inches between us. The cabin is small. There was nowhere for either of us to be that wasn't relatively proximate to the other, and I had spent 2 seasons engineering a kind of proximate distance that I was no longer, in this particular cabin on this particular night, able to maintain. How did you end up in Glacier? I asked, the most personal question I'd ever asked him. He looked at me the way he sometimes looked at a clinical situation. Not the patient, but the context surrounding the patient. Then, wilderness medicine rotation, 2nd year of med school. First time I was in the backcountry, I realized I'd been waiting for it my whole life. He paused. Addis Ababa is 7,500 feet. When I got to altitude here, it felt familiar. Did you go back after residency? Baltimore for residency. Baltimore for the fellowship. He tilted his head slightly. You've been here 9 years. Yeah, did you always know you'd stay? I thought about it. I knew I couldn't leave, I said, which is a different thing. And he caught the difference. I could see him catch it. The park, he said. The park, I said, and other things. I need you to understand something about what happened next, because this is the part that surprised me. I'm not indirect. In the field, I am precise, and I say what I mean. This had been, for 2 seasons, an operational advantage and a significant personal problem, because the thing I was not saying was sitting across that table from me, approximately 18 inches away, and I had been not saying it with considerable effort for a very long time. Søren, Dex said. He said my name the way he said everything, completely. Not as a preamble, just as a statement of my presence exactly, in the place where I was. Yeah, I said. I've been trying to decide if this is an appropriate conversation to have. In what context? Professional context. He looked at the table, then back up. We work together, seasonally. That's still. I know. I set down my mug. Outside, the storm. Inside, the stove light and the sleeping hikers and Marcus breathing steadily on the lower bunk. I know what it is. I've been aware of what it is for 2 seasons, and I've been maintaining distance, he said. Not accusatory. Observational. Yes, I noticed. Yeah, I said. I figured. There was a silence. Not uncomfortable. The particular silence of 2 people being careful and honest at the same time, which is its own kind of closeness. My season ends Sunday, he said. I know. Bozeman for 3 months. Then I have an offer from the Park Service in Rocky Mountain for next spring. He held my gaze. Colorado. It's a good program, strong WEM component, solid SAR relationship. A pause, very deliberate. Not here. The stove popped once. The radio cycled. Marcus shifted on his bunk and Dex's eyes went to him automatically. A breath count, a neuro check. and then back to me. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I'm trying to decide, he said, and I don't have complete information. And this is the part. This is what I keep coming back to. I have spent 9 years making decisions in incomplete information on the side of a mountain. I am still not good at it in this particular context. But there is a thing that happens when you've been holding a position for too long, not because it's wrong, but because the cost of holding it has become greater than the cost of releasing it, and you feel it give. Not like failure, like a mountain releasing its snowpack in spring, which is technically a hazard, but is also undeniably a relief. Stay, I said. Just that. One word. He looked at me for a long moment. The stove, the radio, the storm outside and the warmth inside, and 11 hours of night ahead of us. That's a significant ask for one word, he said. I know. I paused. I have more words if you need them. I might. But the edge of his mouth had done something. 2 seasons, I said. You've been 2 seasons and I've been... I stopped. Started again. I've been very professionally appropriate. Extremely, he agreed. I don't want to be professionally appropriate anymore. What do you want to be? Present, I said, which is not a word I normally use, but it was the accurate one. I want to be actually present in whatever this is instead of, I gestured at the space between us, which was still 18 inches, but felt different now. This. He reached across the table, not dramatically, the gesture of someone who has finished thinking and is now moving, which, I understood, was exactly how he did everything. He put his hand over mine on the table. His hands were warm from the coffee mug. I turned my hand over. Rocky Mountain is a good program, I said. It is. Glacier is better. He looked at me. Glacier doesn't have a WEM position. Glacier has a lead ranger who's been trying to figure out how to ask you to stay for 8 months and just ran out of professionally appropriate options. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, but the expression of someone who has been reading a structure carefully for a very long time and has just confirmed the load calculation. 8 months, give or take. Søren. Yeah, you could have just... I know, I said. I'm aware. He pressed his lips together, and there was something in his eyes that I hadn't let myself look at directly before, and was now looking at directly, and it was, well, worth 8 months of not looking. I'll call Rocky Mountain in the morning, he said. My chest did something. You don't have to. I want to. He held my gaze. I want to find out if there's something here worth building. A pause, and then the specific quiet version of a smile that I had been cataloging without admitting I was cataloging it for 8 months. I'm a physician. Structural assessments are part of the job. And structure looks sound, he said, from where I'm sitting. Marcus was evacuated by helicopter at 0641 the following morning. 47 degrees at the trailhead, clear all the way to the Continental Divide. The 4 Denver hikers descended under escort. Dex's season ended technically on Sunday. He did not take the Rocky Mountain position. He spent the winter in Bozeman, 45 minutes from the park's west entrance, close enough for a drive that became, as the months passed, routine. Neither of us rushed anything. We're not built that way, and we both knew it. We used the time that was available, carefully, the way you use anything in the backcountry, knowing the resource is finite, knowing conditions can change, moving deliberately and with your eyes open. The following June, he came back to Glacier. Official NPS Wilderness Emergency Medicine contract, one of 2 physicians assigned to the park for the summer season. His first day back on station, I happened to be passing the medical trailer at the Swift Current trailhead at approximately 0800. This was not deliberate. He was unpacking his kit. He looked up when I knocked on the open door. Ranger Vael, he said. Dr. Amara. He looked at me for a moment, that structural assessment look, the one I now knew I no longer needed to translate. And then he stepped aside to let me in. There's a trail camera on the Ptarmigan Wall approach, motion activated, set up to catch mountain goat activity for the wildlife monitoring program. The data gets downloaded once a week by a ranger who has too much coffee and not enough time. In late October that year, the download pulled a 7-second clip from the previous Saturday, 2 figures on the upper approach in the afternoon light, which was doing its late October thing in Glacier, all amber and horizontal and long. One of them stopped and turned to the other and said something, and the audio wasn't good enough to catch it, but you could see the second one's face clearly enough, and whatever was said, whatever those words were on that trail in that light, the second one looked at the first the way you look at someone when you have decided. Really, completely decided, that the structure is sound enough to build on. They kept walking. The mountain held. The light did what the light in Glacier does in October. It lasted a very long time.